Hello and welcome to History Sleep Stories. Before engines hummed and wings cut clean lines through blue air, the world remained bound to the ground by more than gravity. For centuries, the sky was a place of longing rather than arrival, watched from below with wonder and resignation. Birds moved through it effortlessly, clouds drifted without permission, and stars crossed it nightly, while human beings remained spectators. Stories spoke of flight as magic or punishment, something borrowed briefly and paid for dearly. Wax melted, feathers failed, and every myth seemed to end the same way, with a fall. As you settle in to listen to this sleep story, a like and a subscription are a quiet way to support this channel. And if you feel comfortable, you're warmly invited to share where you're listening from in the comments. Inventors sketched wings in notebooks and margins, convinced that imitation alone might be enough. They built frames of wood and cloth, trusting hope more than understanding. Each attempt carried the same belief, that lift was the secret, that if one could only rise, the rest would follow. Yet time after time, machines left the earth only to surrender to it again. Failures piled quietly on fields, beaches, and hillsides, leaving behind broken parts and quieter ambition. The sky remained untouched, not because it was unreachable, but because it was misunderstood. The 19th century arrived with confidence and noise. Steam conquered land and sea, electricity promised mastery overnight, and progress felt inevitable. Many believed flight would simply be next, another problem destined to collapse under effort and money. But aviation resisted this certainty. Well-funded experiments ended in disappointment, public demonstrations in embarrassment. Newspapers chronicled crashes with thinly veiled amusement, reinforcing the idea that human flight was either foolish or premature. Each failure deepened the belief that the sky demanded something humanity had not yet learned to give. What held progress back was not courage, nor imagination, but patience and humility. The air behaved by rules that refused to announce themselves. It punished assumptions and ignored bravado. Those who rushed toward spectacle often found themselves repeating the same mistakes, mistaking motion for mastery. The world watched these attempts with a mixture of hope and doubt, wanting to believe while expecting another ending already written by history. Flight hovered perpetually on the edge of possibility, close enough to imagine, distant enough to doubt. And yet, the dream did not fade. It softened, becoming quieter, more private. It lived in careful observations, in long hours spent watching birds turn and glide, in questions asked without audiences. The absence of success began to hint at a deeper truth, that the problem was not the sky, but understanding it. Control, balance, and responsiveness remained unnamed necessities, waiting for minds willing to listen rather than declare. This was the world before flight, suspended between desire and limitation. A world where the sky had been studied, challenged, and romanticized, but never truly entered. Progress stood still not because humanity lacked the tools, but because it lacked the insight to use them correctly. The stage was set not for louder experiments or grander machines, but for a different approach entirely. Somewhere beyond public attention, the long history of failure was quietly preparing the ground for something unexpected to finally rise. In that waiting silence, centuries of disappointment pressed gently against the future. Every failed attempt narrowed the path forward, stripping away illusion and excess, leaving only essential questions behind. How does air truly move, and how must a human mind move with it? These questions lingered unanswered, shaping an invisible threshold. Once crossed, they would change everything. But for now, the world remained grounded, unaware that the age of watching was nearing its end, and that understanding, not ambition, would soon decide who touched the sky. The moment awaited patience, precision, and a quieter kind of courage. While the world waited for a grand figure to solve the mystery of the sky, the answer did not arrive in the form most expected. It did not emerge from a celebrated university, a government laboratory, or the workshop of a wealthy industrialist. Instead, it took shape quietly, far from headlines and exhibitions, in the lives of two men who seemed almost deliberately unremarkable. In an age dazzled by spectacle and authority, they offered neither. They were not loud, not socially prominent, and not interested in being seen. Their ordinariness made them invisible. The Wright brothers belonged to a generation surrounded by confidence. The late 19th century admired bold declarations and public demonstrations of genius. Inventors competed for attention as much as for truth, and success often depended on who could command the largest audience. Against this backdrop, two quiet brothers appeared poorly suited for greatness. They did not present themselves as visionaries. They made no promises to the press. Their ambitions, if spoken at all, were modest and careful, framed more as questions than claims. They were shaped by routine rather than privilege. Their days followed predictable rhythms, marked by work, reading, and observation. They lived without excess, without the security of powerful patrons, and without formal credentials that might impress institutions. Where others sought validation through recognition, they seemed content with private certainty. This absence of urgency to be acknowledged created an irony that few could have predicted. The very traits that made them easy to overlook would become their greatest strength. To outsiders, they looked like men who understood their limits. They spoke cautiously, avoided exaggeration, and distrusted assumptions. In a culture that celebrated confidence, such restraint appeared like hesitation. Yet beneath this surface calm existed an intense discipline of thought. They questioned everything, including their own conclusions. Instead of racing toward results, they lingered in uncertainty, allowing problems to unfold slowly. This patience, mistaken for lack of ambition, shielded them from the mistakes that trapped louder minds. Their environment offered no special encouragement. There were no institutions guiding their curiosity, no mentors ushering them toward accepted paths. What they had instead was mutual trust. Each brother became the other's sounding board, critic, and collaborator. Ideas were not protected by ego but tested through conversation. Disagreement sharpened understanding rather than threatening identity. In this partnership, thought evolved without performance, free from the pressure to impress anyone beyond the room they shared. The era they lived in valued hierarchy, but they valued process. While celebrated inventors guarded their methods and rushed toward acclaim, the brothers remained anonymous students of problems others believed already solved. This created a quiet separation from the age itself. They were present in time but detached from its expectations. Their focus narrowed not toward fame or reward, but toward clarity. The question was never how to be first, but how to be correct. There was nothing heroic in their appearance, nothing cinematic in their routines. Their progress unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, shaped by trial, error, and revision. Yet this lack of drama concealed a profound advantage. Free from pressure to perform, they could afford to be wrong repeatedly. Each mistake became information rather than embarrassment. Each correction refined their thinking. Where public failure discouraged others, private failure educated them. This contrast defined their place in history long before history noticed them. Surrounded by men who chased the sky with noise and speed, they moved quietly along the ground, gathering understanding piece by piece. Their humility allowed them to learn where others insisted on declaring. Their obscurity protected them from imitation and interference. It allowed them to work without interruption, guided only by curiosity and discipline. In a time that expected brilliance to announce itself, they did not. In an age convinced that progress required spectacle, they chose silence. These choices lowered expectations so completely that no one thought to look their way. And yet, in that invisibility, something rare was forming. A way of thinking unburdened by tradition, uncorrupted by applause, and patient enough to listen to forces others tried to dominate. As the century advanced and the dream of flight remained unresolved, these two ordinary figures continued their quiet work, unnoticed and underestimated. Nothing about them suggested they were approaching the threshold history had prepared. But that was precisely the point. The future of flight was not waiting for the most impressive voice. It was waiting for the most attentive mind. And attention, cultivated in obscurity, was about to change the sky. As their quiet partnership deepened, the brothers' attention settled not on the sky, but on something far more ordinary. Day after day, they worked inside a modest bicycle shop, surrounded by tools, grease-stained hands, and the steady rhythm of mechanical problem-solving. To the outside world, this work appeared unrelated to humanity's oldest dream. Bicycles were practical, grounded, and unromantic. They belonged firmly to the earth. Yet within that small space, a different kind of education was unfolding, one that would quietly shape how the brothers understood movement itself. The Wright brothers learned balance not as a theory, but as a lived experience. A bicycle, once in motion, is neither stable nor unstable by nature. It exists in a constant negotiation between forces, responding instantly to the smallest input. Riders do not calculate angles or forces consciously, they feel them. The brothers repaired machines that refused to behave when neglected, machines that punished rigid thinking and rewarded subtle adjustment. Over time, this relationship with motion became intuitive rather than analytical. In the bicycle shop, control mattered more than speed. A poorly aligned wheel could throw a rider without warning. A minor imbalance could grow into catastrophe if ignored. Solutions were rarely dramatic. They were incremental, precise, and often invisible once completed. This taught a lesson few recognized, that mastery often looks like simplicity, but simplicity is earned through deep understanding. The brothers absorbed this principle quietly, without knowing it would later become essential. While others approached flight as a problem of power, the bicycle taught the brothers something different. Movement was not about force alone, but responsiveness. A rider does not overpower instability, they cooperate with it. They adjust constantly, guided by feedback rather than assumption. This pattern repeated itself in every repair, every test ride, every fine adjustment made to satisfy a customer who only wanted a smoother journey home. Over time, the brothers' minds grew fluent in this language of balance. The shop also cultivated patience. Bicycles refused to be rushed. Each problem demanded careful attention, and shortcuts rarely held. When mistakes were made, consequences appeared immediately. This feedback loop sharpened judgment and discouraged arrogance. The brothers learned to trust evidence over expectation, results over reputation. Unlike public experiments, their failures here were private, inexpensive, and instructive. Nothing was wasted. There was also freedom in this work. The bicycle shop paid bills and demanded no declarations of ambition. It allowed curiosity to develop without scrutiny. Ideas could be explored without needing justification. In this environment, questions grew organically. Why does balance feel automatic once learned? Why does control matter more than raw strength? Why does a system succeed when it adapts instead of resists? These questions lingered beneath routine, shaping thought long before they were consciously applied elsewhere. The irony lay in how invisible this preparation was. To observers, the brothers were tradesmen, not theorists. Their hands were marked by labor, not by academic distinction. Yet this distance from formal authority became an advantage. Unburdened by established doctrine, they approached problems with fewer assumptions. They trusted experience over consensus, observation over tradition. What they learned came not from textbooks, but from thousands of small interactions with machines that demanded respect for balance. As bicycles moved through streets and paths, the brothers watched closely. They noticed how riders leaned instinctively into turns, how motion stabilized itself when properly guided. These observations settled quietly into memory, forming patterns rather than formulas. The lessons were not labeled or stored consciously. They became part of how the brothers thought. When later confronted with unfamiliar challenges, these patterns would resurface, offering guidance where theory alone fell short. The shop became a place where the extraordinary hid inside the ordinary. Nothing suggested that world-changing ideas were forming among chains and spokes. Yet history often favors such spaces. Progress rarely announces its arrival. It develops quietly, nourished by repetition and curiosity. The brothers' work trained them to see systems rather than spectacles, relationships rather than isolated parts. By the time their attention began drifting upward again, toward the sky that had resisted humanity for so long, they carried with them an education no institution could have offered. They understood motion as dialogue, not domination. They knew that stability could be achieved through constant adjustment rather than rigid strength. These insights had not been sought with flight in mind, yet they were precisely what flight required. What appeared small and unrelated was, in truth, foundational. The bicycle shop did not teach them how to fly, but it taught them how to think. And thinking, shaped patiently through ordinary work, was about to reveal that the path to the sky did not begin with engines or wings, but with balance learned close to the ground. The knowledge gained from countless bicycle repairs gave the brothers a foundation few could imagine. They understood the language of balance and motion, but the sky still remained an enigma. Flight was not a puzzle that could be solved with intuition alone, it demanded observation, analysis, and the willingness to confront failure without ego. While the world around them sought spectacle and accolades, the Wright brothers approached the problem differently. They did not race toward fame, nor did they attempt to impress with grandiose designs. Instead, they studied failure, not as a setback to avoid, but as a teacher to understand. At the time, many pioneers of aviation were celebrated, funded, and well publicized. They had access to money, materials, and prestige, yet their efforts often reflected impatience rather than understanding. Machines were built rapidly, demonstrations staged before proof of principle, and failures were treated as embarrassments to be hidden. These experimenters operated under the assumption that force and ambition could substitute for insight, that power alone could compensate for inattention to detail. Their airframes were large, complex, and heavy, their mistakes were costly and public. Each crash was recorded in newspapers, laughed at by the press, and memorably dismissed by skeptics as confirmation that human flight was folly. The Wright brothers, in contrast, built smaller, simpler machines, designed to teach rather than impress. They carefully catalogued each result, whether success or failure, noting subtle changes in wind, surface, and structure. They studied previous experiments, analyzing the failures of others to extract principles rather than repeat mistakes. In this way, the failures of the famous and wealthy became their lessons, guiding their own experiments in a way that public spectacle could not. Each crash of a contemporary machine was not a joke or a disappointment, it was data waiting to be understood. Intellectual humility became a cornerstone of their approach. Where others assumed they already knew the answers, the brothers questioned everything. They asked why a wing failed, why control was impossible in certain conditions, why some principles worked only under limited circumstances. This methodical curiosity required patience, discipline, and the willingness to remain unnoticed. They recognized that true innovation often requires silence and reflection, not applause or immediate recognition. Their focus was on mastery rather than validation, and this mindset allowed them to see patterns others ignored. Contrast framed their advantage clearly. While the world equated scale with capability, the brothers measured learning in iterations. Whereas competitors relied on money to push through obstacles, the Wrights relied on observation to anticipate them. Their machines were not grand, they were functional. Their progress was not public, it was precise. The arrogance of better-funded experimenters blinded them to the subtleties of control, aerodynamics, and lift. They overlooked the importance of coordinated movement between rudder, wing, and pilot. They failed to account for the smallest adjustments, the nuanced feedback loops between human and machine. Every misstep the world celebrated or derided became a stepping stone for two quiet mechanics whose success would eventually overshadow spectacle. The Wright brothers' study of failure was not limited to reading about others. They kept meticulous notes, sketched designs, and conducted small-scale experiments with kites and gliders. Each flight, each adjustment, was a controlled test designed to isolate a single variable. They resisted shortcuts, knowing that skipping steps would compromise understanding. This patience contrasted sharply with the era's prevailing culture of rapid advancement, where the allure of publicity often outweighed careful analysis. In doing so, the brothers cultivated a mindset that was rare, almost revolutionary, not because it sought attention, but because it sought truth. There was also a quiet confidence in their method, born from repeated verification. Whereas others relied on assumption or instinct, they relied on measurement, observation, and experience. A gust of wind, a subtle change in the airfoil, or the weight of the pilot was recorded, analyzed, and understood. Failure became a tool, not a mark of shame, and every miscalculation taught a lesson that could be applied immediately. The world around them treated failure as embarrassment, the brothers treated it as guidance. This intellectual reversal, learning more from failure than from apparent success, gave them an advantage invisible to those focused on spectacle. By combining humility with careful observation, the Wright brothers were able to extract insight from a world littered with public disappointment. While others chased recognition, they cultivated understanding. The arrogance of the era became their silent ally, allowing them to operate without interference, unseen, unnoticed, and uninterrupted. They learned what others could not, that flight was not a matter of grand gestures but of precise knowledge, patience, and respect for the forces at play. In this way, their mindset itself became their most innovative tool. They approached flight not as a conquest, but as a dialogue with the wind, the air, and the principles that governed it. The failures of others were no longer warnings, they were stepping stones. The world's obsession with glory and spectacle blinded it to progress that could not be shouted. In patience, in careful observation, and in the quiet study of failure, the Wright brothers were preparing to do what no one else had managed, to fly not by accident or boldness, but by understanding. While the world celebrated the grand gestures of inventors and pioneers, the Wright brothers continued their quiet, painstaking work, far from applause or recognition. Each day brought repetition, calculation, and careful adjustment. Theirs was not a journey of spectacle, but of meticulous persistence. Their machines, simple and unassuming, became extensions of their own understanding, each hinge and joint a lesson in patience. Yet even with this clarity, the path was far from easy. Isolation weighed heavily. The brothers worked in relative obscurity, their successes invisible to the world, their failures entirely private. While others gained fame for dramatic crashes or public displays, the Wrights labored in silence, with only one another to share the burden of doubt and expectation. Financial strain added another layer of pressure. Unlike their wealthier contemporaries, the brothers had no patrons to fund experiments. Their bicycle shop supported their household and sustained their work, but its earnings were modest and unpredictable. Each new test required careful planning, every piece of material purchased with measured consideration. They could not afford mistakes in procurement or careless spending, even minor oversights risked derailing weeks of preparation. Money was never merely currency, it was the invisible hand shaping every decision, forcing them to innovate within constraints that others with abundant resources would never know. Yet it was not only material limitation that tested them. The emotional toll of pursuing a dream that few believed in, an endeavor that seemed, to outsiders, impossible, was immense. Each night, the brothers faced the quiet hum of their own uncertainty. What if the patterns they had observed, the lessons gleaned from bicycles and gliders, were insufficient? What if the next test ended in another crash, another disappointment to reinforce the world's doubt? Fear was not absent, it was constant, but it was tempered by discipline and mutual trust. Each brother relied on the other as both critic and ally, sharing the weight of worry and the small triumphs that punctuated their work. Their partnership was both a shield and a laboratory, containing all the hope, fear, and resolve necessary to continue. The solitude of their chosen path amplified their doubts but also honed their focus. Removed from public scrutiny and societal expectation, they could experiment freely, learning from every misstep without external pressure to perform. Yet this freedom came at the cost of companionship beyond each other. Days were long, often beginning before sunrise and stretching into the late hours of the night. Meals were simple, sleep brief, and conversation limited to plans, adjustments, and observations. The world moved on around them, celebrating louder successes and dismissing quieter efforts, unaware that the foundation of true progress was being laid in relative silence. As each glider was constructed, tested, and adjusted, tension grew. Failures were inevitable, even small miscalculations could send a machine tumbling to the ground. Yet each collapse, each setback, was examined, understood, and corrected. The brothers learned to embrace failure as an intimate teacher, a guide that revealed flaws and hidden possibilities. Their minds became attuned to nuance, the slightest change in wind direction, the subtle resistance of fabric, the exact weight distribution of the pilot. Success was measured not in spectacle but in understanding, and each incremental gain was a quiet victory in itself. Despite the burden of isolation, financial pressure, and repeated failure, the brothers' work was sustained by an almost imperceptible optimism. It was not loud or brash, nor did it demand recognition. Instead, it was a steady, quiet belief in the principles they had observed, a faith born of experience rather than rhetoric. This belief allowed them to face uncertainty without paralysis, to treat each new challenge as an opportunity rather than a verdict. Theirs was a perseverance that grew from immersion in the task itself, a focus so complete that the world outside became irrelevant. The psychological weight of such work was considerable. Doubts crept in at unexpected moments, after a test gone wrong, when winds shifted unpredictably, when finances tightened, or when the brothers briefly imagined the enormity of the challenge ahead. Each time, their response was deliberate. They returned to the data, to careful observation, to small experiments, and to each other. Emotional regulation, self-discipline, and mutual support became as important as mechanical skill. The journey demanded not only technical mastery but emotional resilience, a quality rarely documented yet fundamental to their eventual triumph. In this period, the line between work and life blurred. The brothers' existence became defined by the pursuit of understanding, with few interruptions, distractions, or diversions. The shop, the gliders, and the surrounding fields became their universe. Within this focused world, small victories carried immense weight, a correction that improved lift, a design adjustment that stabilized flight, a new understanding of control. Each success was a spark in the long darkness of uncertainty, reinforcing the belief that progress was possible, even if the world did not yet notice. And yet, perhaps most importantly, this period shaped their character. Obsession without applause forged resilience, patience, and humility. They learned to trust process over recognition, to value insight over visibility. By living so close to the challenge, they cultivated a deep understanding of not only flight mechanics but also the psychology of learning, failure, and incremental mastery. These lessons, invisible to observers, would become critical in transforming quiet preparation into historic achievement. Theirs was a world of tension, suspense, and emotional labor, where every day carried the risk of failure and the faint possibility of discovery. In isolation, under financial and emotional pressure, they honed a practice that was rigorous, intelligent, and profoundly patient. They were not yet flying, but the foundation for flight was being laid, not in crowds or ceremonies, but in silence, perseverance, and relentless attention to detail. And it was this quiet, unobserved obsession that would allow them to achieve what so many others could not, proving that greatness often grows unnoticed, nurtured by discipline and love for the work itself. I can continue next with Section 6, Choosing the Wind, the Sand, and Isolation, 900 words, keeping the flow seamless and gradually moving toward the breakthroughs in flight. Do you want me to proceed with that? The world around the Wright brothers continued its bustling momentum, filled with the noise of industry, the confidence of inventors, and the expectation of spectacle. Yet for the two men who had chosen patience over applause, silence over fanfare, the very environment of their work had become a limiting factor. Crowded streets, prying eyes, and unpredictable interruptions threatened to distort their experiments. To pursue mastery of flight, they required a setting that was both expansive and uncompromising, a place that would teach the lessons no classroom or shop could provide. They needed wind, sand, and space. They needed isolation. The choice was deliberate. They selected the open expanses of Kitty Hawk, a remote stretch of beach where the wind blew steadily and the terrain offered few obstacles. Here, they would trade comfort for clarity, familiarity for insight. The isolation was not imposed, it was a tool, chosen for its ability to amplify observation and reduce distraction. The beach became both classroom and laboratory, its gusting winds and shifting dunes shaping every test, every design adjustment, and every understanding of control. They were no longer working within the predictable confines of a bicycle shop, the air itself would become a teacher, relentless and impartial. Environmental immersion was essential. On the beach, every element of the world demanded attention. The wind could lift or topple, gust or subside, challenging their designs and judgment in equal measure. Sand resisted wheels, shifted beneath structures, and tested the durability of gliders. Even the tides played a role, reminding them of forces beyond human control. In this setting, failure was immediate and instructive. Each gust that flipped a machine taught a lesson that could not be conveyed by diagrams alone. The environment became an active participant in their education, enforcing principles they might otherwise have overlooked. Isolation amplified the stakes of each experiment. Far from curiosity seekers, competitors, and spectators, the brothers could pursue incremental progress without distraction. Mistakes were private, learning uninterrupted. Yet solitude also heightened awareness of risk. There were no witnesses to applaud triumphs or cushion the embarrassment of error. Each decision, each adjustment, carried the full weight of responsibility. In choosing to work alone, they embraced discomfort as a constant companion, recognizing that mastery required endurance as much as intellect. The harshness of the setting was a teacher in itself. Cold mornings, blistering afternoons, and unpredictable storms forced the brothers to confront their own limits. They endured physical strain, fatigue, and the mental pressure of repetitive testing. This sacrifice was not incidental, it was deliberate. They understood that only by subjecting themselves and their machines to unforgiving conditions could they isolate truths about control, lift, and motion. Comfort, familiarity, and convenience had no place in this pursuit. The wind would not adjust to their needs, they would have to adapt to its demands. Choosing such a remote environment also symbolized their philosophical approach. Just as they had withdrawn from the distractions of public acclaim, they now withdrew from the compromises of convenience. The air, the sand, and the solitude forced clarity. Decisions had to be immediate and precise, guided by observation rather than theory alone. The brothers could no longer rely on approximation or assumption. They had entered a dialogue with the elements, one that required humility, attention, and responsiveness. Even within this isolation, progress was measured in increments. The brothers learned to read the wind, to feel subtle currents, and to anticipate shifts that could destabilize their gliders. Each adjustment was deliberate, each trial a lesson. Observation became second nature, patterns emerged from repetition. The beach was no longer merely a backdrop, it was an instrument through which knowledge was extracted. Every gust, every slip, every successful glide reinforced understanding, shaping intuition as much as technical skill. Anticipation built naturally in this environment. Success was no longer defined by spectacle but by insight. Every test contained the potential for revelation or collapse, and the brothers approached each with the same careful attention. This tension, quietly sustained over weeks and months, honed focus. It sharpened their ability to respond to the subtle interplay between machine, body, and wind. The air itself became an unpredictable collaborator, requiring constant adaptation, observation, and patience. By choosing the wind, the sand, and isolation, the Wright brothers removed themselves from the ordinary pressures of society. They traded applause for accuracy, distraction for discipline, and comfort for lessons the elements alone could provide. Each day on that remote beach brought them closer to understanding forces that had confounded generations. The environment was both teacher and crucible, forging a partnership between mind, machine, and nature that no laboratory could replicate. In this space, every failure became a blueprint, every adjustment a refinement, and every glide a message from the air itself. The world outside continued its predictable rhythm, unaware of the subtle preparation underway. Here, in wind and sand, the Wright brothers were learning the language of flight, one controlled experiment at a time, laying the foundation for breakthroughs that would soon lift them, quite literally, above the limits that had restrained humanity for centuries. As the wind whipped across the remote sands of Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers' experiments reached a critical stage. Months of observation, adjustment, and failure had honed not only their machines but their understanding of the subtle interplay between human and air. Others believed that flight depended solely on power, on engines strong enough to lift machines skyward, or on wings broad enough to generate enough lift. The world had long assumed that brute force and scale would conquer the sky. Yet the brothers, through quiet patience and careful observation, were arriving at a revelation no one else seemed to notice: flight was not won through strength alone, it was mastered through control. Control was invisible to those who chased spectacle. It could not be measured in horsepower or wingspan, nor could it be shown in a newspaper illustration. While other experimenters built larger, heavier machines, often collapsing under their own weight or tumbling from the air, the Wright brothers asked a different question: how does a human body interact with a machine to manage instability? How does one respond to shifts in wind or subtle tilts in the glider's frame? These were questions that required no grand public demonstration, only acute observation, iteration, and an understanding of the dynamics at play. The breakthrough came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Through gliders and kites, they discovered that the key to sustained flight lay in the pilot's ability to manipulate the machine's movements continuously. Tilt, twist, and adjustment, these were not minor details, they were the difference between a crash and a glide. The brothers' genius lay not in inventing new power sources, but in understanding that every lift-dependent machine must also have a way to respond to the air in real time. Without control, power was meaningless, and lift was useless. This principle had been overlooked for decades because it was subtle, intangible, and counterintuitive. Others had dismissed control as a minor consideration. They had assumed that stability would arise naturally from design or from larger wings, believing that once a plane could rise, it could stay there. Each failure of their contemporaries reinforced the misconception. Machines wobbled, spiraled, and fell, not because engines lacked strength or wings lacked area, but because the pilots could not adjust to the constant changes of the environment. The air is not passive, it resists, shifts, and reacts. To ignore this is to invite disaster. The brothers' insight flipped the prevailing assumption on its head: flight was not just a battle against gravity, but a dialogue with it. The realization of control demanded new design thinking. Wings needed to respond to movement, the rudder had to work in concert with the pilot, and small adjustments had to translate into immediate effects on the machine's trajectory. The Wrights devised systems that allowed the pilot to feel the air, to make subtle corrections instinctively, and to maintain stability across unpredictable conditions. These were not flashy inventions, they were elegant solutions born of understanding rather than spectacle. What seemed simple was, in fact, revolutionary, because it addressed a fundamental principle that had eluded the world for decades. The brothers' method combined observation, experimentation, and careful documentation. Every glide and every adjustment was recorded, analyzed, and applied to the next flight. The breakthrough of control emerged not in a single dramatic moment, but as a cumulative understanding, the result of hundreds of small experiments that individually seemed inconsequential. The brilliance lay in connecting the dots, in seeing the patterns that others missed, and in trusting that mastery of these subtle adjustments was more important than grandeur. This insight also carried profound implications. By focusing on control, the brothers could work with lighter machines, smaller engines, and simpler structures. The innovations that followed would be efficient, precise, and repeatable, qualities that heavier, more powerful machines could not replicate. Others had failed because they approached flight as an engineering problem to be conquered with size and force. The Wrights approached it as a human problem to be understood and accommodated. Their understanding of control created an edge invisible to the world, an advantage so fundamental that it would determine who truly mastered the skies. The breakthrough also carried a psychological component. It required humility to admit that what everyone had been chasing, lift, engine power, or wing area, was insufficient. It required patience to test subtle variations repeatedly, and courage to trust insight derived from observation rather than opinion. The brothers were rewarded not with immediate recognition, but with an understanding that no one else could claim. They had discovered the secret the world was overlooking, and in that secret lay the promise of flight. This revelation turned every prior experiment into a building block rather than a failure. Crashes, gusts, and miscalculations became lessons in control rather than proof of impossibility. The brothers' meticulous attention to nuance, learned from bicycles, gliders, and observation of birds, coalesced into a principle that would redefine aviation. Control was not just a technical challenge, it was the philosophical core of flight, a principle that placed the pilot in a responsive relationship with the machine, rather than making the machine a passive vessel. By understanding control, the Wright brothers gained more than a mechanical advantage, they gained foresight. They could anticipate failure, adjust for instability, and design machines that would respond predictably under unpredictable conditions. Others remained trapped by the illusions of power and size, unable to recognize that the secret had always been subtle, delicate, and human. The world was poised on the brink of flight, yet only those willing to embrace the invisible principle of control would cross the threshold. This was the heart of their innovation. While the world raced toward spectacle, the Wright brothers cultivated understanding. Where others sought lift, they sought mastery, where others pursued power, they pursued responsiveness. In choosing insight over grandeur, observation over assumption, patience over performance, they unlocked the principle that would carry humanity into the sky. The breakthrough that everyone else missed was simple to state, difficult to master, and revolutionary in consequence. Flight is controlled by balance, not force, and by response, not size. And it was this revelation that would transform years of quiet preparation into historic achievement. Even after the revelation of control, the Wright brothers' path was far from assured. Insight alone could not carry a machine through the air. Understanding had to be tested, refined, and repeated under real-world conditions. Each flight, whether a gentle glide or a sudden crash, became a lesson, a living experiment in translating principle into practice. Here, failure was not an endpoint, it was the instrument of progress, a quiet teacher that revealed truths no theory could capture. The world often celebrated success while ignoring failure, but for the brothers, the opposite was true. Each setback refined knowledge, each miscalculation sharpened skill. The beaches of Kitty Hawk became a laboratory where nature enforced honesty. Wind gusts that toppled machines, unexpected shifts in weight that flipped gliders, and fragile structures that crumpled under stress provided immediate feedback. There was no room for conjecture, the consequences were visible and undeniable. Unlike those who sought only to impress or to claim victory, the Wrights embraced each failure as a data point. The repetition of crashes and partial successes did not demoralize, they instructed. The air itself spoke, and they listened with care, absorbing subtle lessons about stability, responsiveness, and timing. Persistence became a psychological necessity. Each failure carried the potential for frustration, doubt, and discouragement, yet the brothers cultivated a mindset that reframed every setback as information. The difference between a mistake and a failure was deliberate interpretation. One could either see a crash as an end or as a hint of what needed adjustment. This mental shift allowed them to engage with their work continuously, maintaining curiosity even in the face of repeated disappointment. The tension inherent in each test, knowing the risk of collapse while seeking insight, was not a deterrent but a catalyst for focus. Small successes, too, carried lessons. A glider that stayed aloft a few seconds longer than the last was not celebrated for its duration but analyzed for what had worked. Was it a slight shift in wing curvature? A subtle change in weight distribution? A response to the wind that had previously gone unnoticed? By dissecting even minor victories, the brothers built a foundation of knowledge that was cumulative and precise. Each incremental gain was folded into the next experiment, a continuous refinement of principle into practice. The iterative process demanded patience and meticulous attention. Adjustments were made carefully, sometimes only millimeter by millimeter. Every modification required observation, measurement, and recalibration. The brothers resisted temptation to shortcut the process. Whereas many experimenters of the era sought immediate results through bolder designs or larger engines, the Wrights allowed experience to dictate pace. Each failure was a correction, each success a confirmation. Over time, this iterative approach began to reveal patterns invisible to those who prioritized spectacle over substance. Failure also served to sharpen foresight. After a glider flipped or a wing failed, the brothers could anticipate what adjustments might prevent recurrence. Their understanding of control deepened not only through direct experience but also through pattern recognition, connecting seemingly isolated events into coherent principles. Where others saw chaos in repeated crashes, they discerned cause and effect, subtle interdependencies between wind, wing, and pilot. This ability to extract knowledge from failure was as crucial as the technical skill of flight itself. The tension of constant testing had another effect, it reinforced resilience. Emotional endurance became as important as mechanical aptitude. Long hours in harsh conditions, repeated exposure to setbacks, and the quiet pressure of self-imposed standards demanded that they develop fortitude alongside insight. The work shaped character as much as machines, teaching the brothers how to remain steady under stress, how to interpret feedback without panic, and how to convert uncertainty into actionable knowledge. This resilience would prove essential when they later attempted flights that would attract attention from the world beyond Kitty Hawk. Through this relentless process, failure ceased to be a mark of incompetence. It became a lens through which truth was revealed, each mishap clarifying principle, highlighting nuance, and pointing toward mastery. The brothers' iterative method transformed the unpredictable air into a reliable teacher, one whose lessons were repeated until understood. The harshness of experience ensured that only what truly worked would survive, forging a system of knowledge more robust than any design derived purely from theory or assumption. Even in these quiet, often discouraging moments, the brothers' partnership strengthened. Each crash was analyzed collaboratively, each correction tested jointly. Shared responsibility mitigated the sting of error and amplified learning. Together, they converted frustration into insight, impatience into precision, and disappointment into preparation. Their relationship, grounded in trust and mutual respect, allowed them to navigate the relentless cycle of trial and error with clarity and purpose. In this crucible of repeated failure, the stage for success was being silently constructed. The world outside continued to focus on loud, dramatic experiments, dismissing those who labored quietly. Yet the lessons being absorbed, the subtle corrections being made, and the intuition being developed were building something far more enduring. Failure, far from an obstacle, became the medium through which mastery emerged. And while no final triumph had yet arrived, the Wright brothers were quietly refining the truths of flight, shaping insight from experience, and preparing to turn invisible lessons into an achievement that would finally lift humanity into the air. On a cold December morning in 1903, the quiet labor of years came to a point of culmination. The sands of Kitty Hawk had witnessed countless glides, miscalculations, and collapses, each one teaching the Wright brothers lessons no textbook could provide. Yet no fanfare awaited them. There were no cheering crowds, no photographers, no journalists to document the moment for posterity. The first powered flight was modest in scale, almost invisible to the untrained eye. And yet, in that subtle rise and fall of a small aircraft, humanity's relationship with the sky was forever changed. The Wright brothers had engineered a machine that incorporated every insight gained from bicycles, gliders, and months of harsh observation. The 12-horsepower engine, though tiny compared to industrial expectations, proved sufficient when paired with precise understanding of lift and, crucially, control. The brothers had designed a system that allowed the pilot to respond instinctively to shifts in wind, balancing stability and movement with a sensitivity others had dismissed as minor. It was not a spectacle, it was a demonstration of principle made tangible, a culmination of subtle mastery honed in isolation. Their first flight, made by Orville Wright, lasted only 12 seconds and covered a distance barely exceeding 120 feet. To an onlooker, it may have seemed negligible, a curious contraption skimming along the sand, but those who understood its implications recognized its magnitude. The machine lifted under its own power, navigated the unstable currents of air, and returned safely. It validated every lesson learned, every failure endured, and every insight into control that had been cultivated quietly over years. The smallness of the moment belied the revolutionary consequences contained within it. Then came 3 more flights, each incrementally longer, each refining technique and confidence. Wilbur took the controls for some runs, demonstrating that the design worked consistently under repeated use. Distances increased, the machines responded predictably. What had once been theoretical, the harmonious interaction between pilot, machine, and air, had become tangible reality. The brothers' patient method, their intimate understanding of control, and their meticulous observations had coalesced into success. History was not announced with a grand gesture, it unfolded quietly, measured in seconds and feet. The contrast between these understated flights and the world's expectation could not have been greater. Society had long imagined that human flight would arrive as a spectacle, with roaring engines, massive wings, and dramatic public displays. Instead, the Wright brothers achieved it with restraint, precision, and subtlety. Yet within the modest flights lay all the elements necessary to change everything: sustained, controlled, powered movement through air. What seemed a simple mechanical achievement was, in truth, a conceptual revolution. Humanity could now leave the ground not by chance, not by accident, but with purpose and understanding. There was awe in this quiet achievement, the kind that builds slowly rather than overwhelms in a single moment. Observers, including the brothers themselves, understood that the significance of these first flights could not be measured in duration or distance. The real accomplishment was mastery over instability, a principle that no previous engineer or inventor had implemented successfully. The air, once an insurmountable barrier, had been negotiated with precision and insight. Power alone could not have achieved this. It required control, patience, and observation honed over years of meticulous effort. Emotionally, the flights were understated yet profound. There was relief, certainly, as gliders that had toppled countless times now sustained themselves in motion. There was exhilaration, tempered by awareness of the work still to be done. Each flight built confidence in the machine, the pilot, and the principles behind them. But the brothers' joy was quiet, not performative. There were no crowds to applaud, no medals to claim. Instead, satisfaction arose from knowing that years of patient observation, experimentation, and perseverance had been vindicated. The historical weight of the moment would take time to be fully recognized. In the span of 12 to 59 seconds, the duration of the first 4 flights, the Wright brothers had accomplished what generations of dreamers could only imagine. They had proved that powered, controlled, sustained flight was possible. Yet to the world outside Kitty Hawk, the achievement seemed modest, almost imperceptible. This contrast, between understated action and monumental consequence, underscored the subtle genius of the endeavor. History was made in silence, a quiet triumph whose ripple effects would soon sweep across the globe. These first flights also highlighted the importance of iteration and refinement. Each takeoff and landing, each adjustment and correction, reinforced the lessons learned through failure. Control proved itself not once but repeatedly. Success was no longer theoretical, it was reproducible. The principles the brothers had painstakingly codified in gliders, kites, and bicycles now translated directly into powered aviation. The world had been gifted not merely a machine but a blueprint for the future of flight. Finally, these moments marked the culmination of a philosophy the brothers had cultivated over years, that mastery emerges from understanding, not from grandeur, and that the invisible principles governing success are often more important than visible spectacle. The first flights of 1903 were a whisper of history in the making, a demonstration of restraint, precision, and the patient application of insight. Their quiet achievement would ignite the imagination of engineers, aviators, and dreamers worldwide, proving that flight was no longer myth, no longer an aspiration, it was reality. By the end of that day, 4 flights had been completed, each a testament to patience, observation, and a careful negotiation between human and machine. The magnitude of what had occurred was subtle in form but vast in consequence. The Wright brothers had not merely flown, they had rewritten the rules of possibility, quietly, deliberately, and irreversibly, showing that even the smallest acts, when guided by insight and control, can change the world forever. Even as the Wright brothers returned from Kitty Hawk, carrying the proof of humanity's first powered, controlled flight, the world remained unconvinced. Success, it seemed, was not enough. Newspapers treated the claims with skepticism, inventors dismissed them, and institutions regarded the achievement as improbable. To many, the idea that two quiet men from Dayton, Ohio, had achieved what so many had failed to accomplish was absurd. The contrast between the understated reality of the flights and the world's expectation of spectacle created a profound irony, the very modesty that had enabled their breakthrough now delayed recognition. The Wright brothers faced disbelief at every turn. Skeptics demanded verification, photographs, and witnesses, but the first flights had been carried out on a remote beach, far from crowds. The brothers had no interest in grand exhibitions at that stage, they had sought knowledge, not fame. Yet their restraint was misinterpreted as fabrication. Inventors with louder claims and grander machines scoffed, certain that the Wright's small, 12-horsepower engine could never lift a man reliably. Their peers, fueled by pride and competition, saw the modesty of the Wrights' achievement as evidence of exaggeration, unable or unwilling to reconcile that innovation could be subtle rather than ostentatious. Even institutions were slow to respond. Scientific societies, journals, and funding bodies had long been accustomed to associating progress with spectacle, scale, and established authority. The Wright brothers, uncredentialed, humble, and methodical, did not fit the mold of the innovators these institutions expected to recognize. Their achievement challenged assumptions about where genius could emerge, who could achieve it, and how it manifested. In a sense, history itself resisted acknowledging that two ordinary men had quietly transformed the limits of human possibility. The ridicule was relentless. Cartoonists, journalists, and rival inventors dismissed the flights as improbable, sometimes ludicrous. The brothers were accused of exaggeration, and their meticulous notes and sketches were treated as elaborate fantasies rather than evidence. The irony was bitter, the same qualities that had enabled success, patience, attention to detail, and restraint, were interpreted as weakness or deception. Those who pursued visibility over understanding were believed, those who pursued truth quietly were doubted. Injustice seemed woven into the narrative of progress itself. This environment tested the brothers' resilience. Frustration was inevitable. After years of labor, repeated failure, and careful study, they faced disbelief when evidence existed to prove their accomplishment. Yet rather than becoming discouraged or abandoning their work, the Wrights relied on the same qualities that had guided them from the start: patience, meticulous documentation, and a steadfast commitment to understanding. They continued to refine their machines, demonstrate control, and collect proof, aware that recognition would come only after persistent demonstration, not immediate acclaim. They also faced practical challenges. Investors, patrons, and industrialists were reluctant to engage with the Wrights. The modest scale of the machine, the lack of dramatic publicity, and the remote location of the flights made it difficult for others to witness or verify results. The brothers could not compel belief, they could only offer careful evidence and repeatable demonstrations. This required both strategic planning and emotional endurance, as repeated requests for verification met with skepticism or outright dismissal. Irony compounded the tension. While the brothers had accomplished what the world thought impossible, those who claimed grand successes with less rigorous preparation received attention. Publicity, spectacle, and charisma seemed to carry weight that truth alone did not. Yet the Wrights' methodical approach, grounded in control, patience, and observation, would ultimately prevail. The initial resistance delayed recognition, but it also highlighted the profound difference between superficial progress and genuine mastery. Amid disbelief, the brothers found allies in unexpected places. Individuals who examined their notes, understood the principles of control, or witnessed glides firsthand began to grasp the magnitude of the achievement. Slowly, credibility accumulated. Yet the process was agonizingly slow, measured in months and years rather than hours or days. Every small validation was hard-won, earned through diligence rather than spectacle. This period reinforced the lesson that true innovation often struggles against perception, and that the weight of history can lag far behind the reality of accomplishment. The tension between accomplishment and recognition emphasized a subtle but crucial point: mastery and understanding do not always align with immediate visibility. The Wright brothers' breakthrough, achieved through restraint, observation, and iteration, was invisible to those seeking spectacle. History itself hesitated to record it, creating a period in which the inventors were both triumphant and ignored, victorious yet questioned. This paradox would follow them for years, shaping their interactions with institutions, investors, and the public. Ultimately, the brothers' perseverance through skepticism reinforced the value of their approach. They continued to refine machines, demonstrate control, and collect irrefutable evidence, confident that truth would prevail despite initial ridicule. Their isolation in thought, combined with meticulous work and restraint, had produced results that no argument or disbelief could erase. The world's doubt only underscored the magnitude of their achievement. To succeed in the face of disbelief was to demonstrate mastery not just over flight, but over the expectations and assumptions of society itself. By the end of this period, history had yet to fully catch up to the quiet triumph of Kitty Hawk. Disbelief, ridicule, and institutional resistance framed the aftermath, prolonging tension even after success. Yet in this space of skepticism, the Wright brothers' approach, methodical, patient, and rigorously evidence-based, remained unshaken. The story of achievement was far from over. The impact of their flights would eventually ripple across the world, but for now, victory existed largely in principle, quietly challenging assumptions and patiently waiting for recognition. The world eventually took notice. Decades of skepticism and ridicule could not withstand the cumulative evidence of the Wright brothers' achievement. By the early 1900s, their flights had been verified, their machines studied, and the principles of controlled powered flight understood. Recognition arrived, but it was far from simple. The accolades came entwined with rivalry, dispute, and the complexities of human ambition. Success, as the Wrights would soon learn, was never a solitary triumph. It carried the weight of competing claims, jealousy, and legal contention. As orders for aircraft began to arrive from foreign governments and private inventors, the Wright brothers faced a new challenge: protecting the intellectual property that had been honed in isolation and hardship. Their patent, filed carefully to cover the mechanisms of control, became the foundation for both recognition and conflict. The world of aviation was suddenly bustling with innovation, but where the brothers had relied on restraint, others pursued invention with speed and ambition. Competitors who had previously dismissed the Wrights now sought to challenge their claim, arguing that flight could be achieved through alternative designs, engines, or configurations. The modesty that had enabled discovery now became a battleground of authority and interpretation. Legal battles were inevitable. The Wrights engaged in extended patent disputes with other inventors, manufacturers, and companies that attempted to circumvent or reinterpret the principle of control. These disputes were draining, financially, emotionally, and professionally. Years of negotiation, litigation, and scrutiny followed, requiring the brothers to shift focus from experimentation to defense. The quiet triumph of Kitty Hawk now demanded energy in courtrooms and offices, arenas where clarity and innovation were less persuasive than rhetoric, precedent, and legal strategy. Recognition, it seemed, came with strings attached, turning victory into a complex, sometimes bitter, experience. At the same time, rivalry emerged in unexpected forms. Engineers who had once dismissed the brothers' small, restrained flights began to claim partial credit for concepts they argued were independent innovations. Journalists revisited earlier skeptics, highlighting their criticisms in contrast to emerging support for the Wrights. Fame arrived alongside scrutiny and challenge, amplifying both the rewards and the pressures of success. The brothers' patience and restraint, once their greatest assets, now had to be balanced with assertiveness, negotiation, and advocacy. Victory was no longer just technical, it was social, legal, and political. The personal cost of recognition was profound. Years of isolation, meticulous work, and emotional endurance had shaped the brothers into disciplined innovators, yet the public stage exposed them to envy, misrepresentation, and scrutiny. Their partnership was tested under the strain of defending their claim while continuing to innovate. Travel, negotiations, and public appearances disrupted routines that had once been carefully controlled. The simplicity of the bicycle shop and remote sands was replaced by complexity, conflict, and relentless external pressure. The psychological demands of success were immense, requiring adaptation to a world that valued spectacle and argument over patient discovery. Yet within this turmoil, the Wrights maintained their principles. They continued to insist on accuracy, clarity, and proof in every claim. They demonstrated flights with the same meticulous care as they had in Kitty Hawk, ensuring that their machines could perform reliably under observation. Even in the midst of rivalry and legal conflict, the core lesson endured: mastery is measured not by recognition alone, but by reproducible achievement. Their success, therefore, remained anchored in reality, even when the world attempted to reinterpret or challenge it. Recognition also revealed the bittersweet nature of being first. While the brothers were celebrated as pioneers, they were never free from the tensions of their era. Every acknowledgement was shadowed by dispute, every honor came alongside skepticism from some quarters. The moral complexity of innovation, ownership, fairness, and legacy became unavoidable. Achieving the impossible had earned them a place in history, but it also exposed them to the unavoidable human tendency to contest, reinterpret, and profit from groundbreaking work. Irony persisted: the same qualities that had enabled their breakthrough, patience, observation, and humility, were now both respected and exploited. Rivals attempted to appropriate methods, governments sought preferential access, and media attention scrutinized the very restraint that had originally permitted success. The Wrights' victory, earned in silence and solitude, had been transformed into a public, contested, and morally complicated stage. Their ingenuity was undeniable, but recognition was entwined with struggle, reminding them and the world that being first carries obligations and burdens invisible to those who arrive later. Ultimately, the brothers' story demonstrates that triumph is rarely uncomplicated. Success does not arrive purely as celebration, it arrives as responsibility, negotiation, and confrontation with both allies and rivals. Recognition, when it comes after decades of labor and skepticism, is powerful, but never free of cost. The Wright brothers' legacy was strengthened by their mastery of control, observation, and perseverance, yet it was also tempered by the demands of authority, legality, and public scrutiny. Their journey illustrates that achieving history-making innovation requires not only skill and patience, but resilience in navigating the consequences of visibility. By the end of this period, the Wright brothers had secured their place as the first to master powered, controlled flight. Yet the path forward was a reminder that innovation is never purely technical. Fame, legitimacy, and authority coexist with conflict, and the price of being first is often measured in struggle as much as achievement. Theirs was a victory intertwined with challenge, a testament to the complexity of history, and a powerful lesson that innovation carries consequences beyond the laboratory, the workshop, or even the skies. Above the modern world, airplanes trace smooth, deliberate paths across skies that span continents. Jetliners, cargo planes, private aircraft, and drones move with precision and consistency, a testament to decades of engineering and refinement. Yet the lineage of that mastery begins not in grand public displays or headline-grabbing inventions, but in the quiet persistence of two brothers from Dayton, Ohio. Orville and Wilbur Wright had no intention of spectacle, their work was rooted in observation, patience, and an intimate understanding of control. Modern flight exists because of their unseen labor, their willingness to endure failure, and their commitment to mastery rather than recognition. The legacy of the Wright brothers is subtle but profound. Every maneuver performed by a pilot today, every calculation executed by autopilot, and every glide through turbulence owes itself to the principles first honed on the windswept sands of Kitty Hawk. Lift, balance, and control, the fundamental elements of flight, were first understood not through engines or power alone, but through careful study of motion, adjustment, and the responsiveness of a machine to human input. These lessons, cultivated in solitude, have cascaded forward through a century of innovation, shaping the possibilities of transportation, commerce, and human experience. Modern engineers and aviators may never witness the precise moments when a small, 12-horsepower aircraft lifted a few feet above a remote beach, but the echo of that achievement resonates through every aircraft that ascends today. It is a reminder that great breakthroughs are often invisible at their inception. The quiet work of observation, repetition, and subtle correction laid the foundation for what would later seem inevitable. History's most transformative innovations are rarely dramatic at first, they require the unseen labor of patience, reflection, and careful adaptation. Consider the principle of control, now taken for granted in every cockpit and flight simulator. The Wright brothers understood that power without responsiveness is meaningless, that lift without guidance is dangerous, and that success is measured not in spectacle but in stability. Modern aircraft, from the simplest training plane to the largest commercial airliner, are governed by control systems that echo the Wrights' original insight. Their genius was to recognize that mastery arises from the interaction between human and machine, a truth that has guided every subsequent innovation in aviation. The personal qualities that enabled the Wright brothers' success, resilience, patience, humility, remain essential to the story of flight. Every test, every failure, and every refinement contributed not only to mechanical understanding but also to the cultivation of mental discipline. In an era dominated by instantaneous results and public recognition, it is striking to reflect that progress was first secured through quiet diligence, repetitive experimentation, and steadfast adherence to principle. Their story reminds us that the most enduring achievements often emerge from persistence rather than spectacle. There is also an existential dimension to this legacy. The sky, once a realm of impossibility, is now accessible to countless people across the globe. Travel, commerce, emergency response, exploration, and even leisure have been transformed by the ability to leave the ground with confidence. Yet the original breakthrough was modest, a glider lifting briefly under a small engine, tested in silence. This contrast invites reflection on how profound change can arise from humble beginnings, and how human innovation often progresses through layers of unseen, incremental effort rather than singular, dramatic acts. The Wright brothers' work also emphasizes the value of deliberate, patient observation. They learned from failure, refined their understanding through iteration, and approached challenges systematically. Modern aviation continues to benefit from this ethos. Design, testing, and operational protocols prioritize safety, control, and responsiveness. Their approach created a framework in which innovation is not reckless but informed, where risk is managed through knowledge rather than assumed by brute force. This mindset underpins contemporary aeronautical engineering, emphasizing that mastery is inseparable from careful preparation and persistent refinement. Even as technology has evolved, the philosophical essence of the Wright brothers' achievement remains instructive. They remind us that transformation requires more than vision, it requires work in conditions that are often unseen, discomfort endured, and failures absorbed. The machines that soar today are built upon principles discovered through their meticulous trials, yet the public perception of aviation often overlooks these quiet foundations. Reflection on this history deepens appreciation for the unseen labor that underlies everyday capabilities and the human ingenuity that makes them possible. The story of flight, when traced back to its roots, illustrates a broader lesson about progress. The most enduring achievements often originate from patience, humility, and a refusal to be distracted by acclaim or external expectation. The Wright brothers' gliders and first powered flights were unassuming, yet they unlocked the door to a century of exploration, innovation, and connection. Each airplane in the sky is, in a sense, a monument to persistence, an acknowledgement of the power of careful observation and the quiet mastery of principles over spectacle. In reflecting upon this legacy, there is a profound calm. The skies above, filled with the constant motion of human innovation, carry with them a reminder that the roots of achievement are often invisible. Orville and Wilbur Wright's contribution to humanity was not merely technical, it was philosophical, teaching that control, patience, and unseen diligence are more powerful than flash or fortune. Every flight today is both a triumph of engineering and a tribute to their quiet persistence, a testament to the enduring impact of careful, deliberate work. As we watch airplanes trace their courses above cities, mountains, and oceans, it is worth remembering the quiet origins of flight. The legacy of the Wright brothers lingers in every controlled ascent, in every precision landing, and in every moment when humans defy gravity with certainty rather than chance. Their story offers reflection, awe, and inspiration, demonstrating that the most transformative contributions often rise from unseen labor, guided by insight, patience, and the relentless pursuit of understanding. The sky we take for granted today carries the imprint of two brothers who believed in control, endurance, and the quiet pursuit of possibility, an inheritance that continues to lift humanity above its limits. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the skies and the lives of the Wright brothers. As you drift off, imagine the quiet persistence and patience that lifted humanity above the ground. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the untold stories of history. Sweet dreams, and may your imagination soar as high as the first flight.